Okay, welcome to the water seminar. Today we don't have any struggle with other people, so to be very calm and quiet. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Bill Blomquist. Professor Blomquist is Professor of Political Science and Adjunct Professor of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University and Purdue University in Indianapolis, joint campus, I'm learning. And Bill received his bachelor degree in economics and master's degree in political sciences from Ohio University, and then did a PhD in political science in Indiana University. And Bill has been working extensively on management and building institutions related to water projects, many in California, but elsewhere as well. And all these kind of short videos in the invitation. And today, Bill will talk here about the multi-governance water resources management, and I believe it is focused on California.
This is actually going to be just general. So okay.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here on such a lovely day. I certainly thank Professor Avner Ben-Gosh for the invitation to be here. I hope you can hear me. Okay. If at any point you can't, please stick a hand up or get my attention in some way. Thanks. As you can see from the cover slide here, this is what I want to talk about today is work that I share with my colleague Adela Schlager. Adela is a professor of public administration and policy at the University of Arizona, and she and I have a book coming out in a few months from University Press of Colorado on politics and watershed management. And since that is new work and it's kind of a combination of a number of disciplinary interests, I thought I would present that. So I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned right up front that my good friend and colleague Adela Schlager contributes to this work. And the paper or the presentation, there was an abstract sent around which I will simply use for a couple of sentences of introduction. The paper combines two streams of multidisciplinary thinking that have emerged or appeared in publications since the 1970s. One concerns the treatment of watersheds and ecosystems as complex adaptive systems. The second concerns polycentric institutional arrangements and what relative advantages or disadvantages they may have compared with integrated centralized organizations. So the paper really focuses on whether and in what ways polycentric institutional arrangements, including multi-level governance, such as that found in federal political systems, could be appropriate for the management of complex adaptive systems such as watersheds under conditions of scientific uncertainty. So that's sort of the goal here, is to weave together these two literatures and see what they might have to say to one another. Now, I'm willing to wager that people who show up for a water seminar or enroll in a water seminar are not all political scientists. So when I throw out a term like polycentric institutional arrangements, while that's an easy enough term to unpack and decipher, it may be new to you. So what we mean by that is, and by the shorter version of polycentricity, is the idea of institutional arrangements, which could be organizations or networks or even legal systems of rules and regulations and so forth, institutional arrangements that are multi-centered, hence polycentric, and not top-down or hierarchical in their structure. So I will be talking about polycentric institutions, polycentricity as this general characteristic of systems that are made up of multiple components but they're institutional systems as opposed to maybe physical systems. They're institutional systems. So our governmental structure in the United States is a pretty good example of polycentricity, but there are lots of other examples as well. And in particular, I'll use the phrase multi-level governance in the title of the talk is a reference to, as I mentioned in the abstract, federal-style political systems where there's overlapping jurisdictions so that you have local, but also maybe regional or provincial, or what in the U.S. we call state, and then national. And of course, when we look at new institutions on the globe like the European Union, then you even have supranational levels of governance. So multi-level governance is meant to capture that notion. Well, it's a way of digging in and saying that without question the institutional arrangements for managing water resources and particularly watersheds in the United States are complicated. There are non-governmental components in watersheds in the United States. You find associations, councils, trusts, partnerships, etc. And there are governmental components to the management of watersheds in the United States, local governments, special districts, state agencies, and so forth. And the governmental components are themselves complex, since our political system features the separation and sharing of powers, as well as federalism and its web of intergovernmental relations. And furthermore, neither the governmental nor non-governmental elements stay fixed for long. Organizations and the rules governing them change, and like their physical counterparts, institutional structures and arrangements shift, sometimes almost imperceptibly, and at other times dramatically. So my opening section of the presentation is ecosystems and watersheds as complex adaptive systems. The idea and the study of complex adaptive systems emerged in connection with rising interest in ecosystems, and since the 1970s, a significant literature on ecosystems as complex adaptive systems has developed and been contributed to by scholars from many disciplines. The concept of complex adaptive systems is encapsulated pretty elegantly, I think, by Bobby Lowe and her colleagues, who wrote the quote that I have on this slide, that complex adaptive systems are composed of a large number of active elements whose rich pattern of interactions produce emergent properties which are not easy to predict by analyzing the separate system components. Now, the connection between complex adaptive systems and ecosystems is that ecosystems also consist of multiple interacting elements, the conditions and behavior of which can change over time in ways that yield unpredictable shifts and outcomes. The literature on ecosystems has had many points of overlap with the literature on watersheds. When analysts and policy advocates try to apply the ecosystem concept to actual settings, they often use watersheds as examples. Ecosystems can be difficult to identify in ways that people can agree on. Nice quote by J.B. Rule, who said, "The term ecosystem is much like Darwinism and Marxism, in that everybody knows what it means, but after not very much discussion of the subject, it turns out everybody's meaning differs to some degree." Elizabeth Barham has connected this difficulty with ecosystems to the attention that watersheds get. As she wrote, "Setting precise boundaries around an ecosystem has proved difficult. So for planners and policymakers in the public arena, the result has often been the adoption of the watershed or catchment as an ecosystem proxy. Watersheds defined by the ridge tops that separate drainage basins from one another provide ecosystem boundaries that are not as open to dispute from one another in terms of their physical location. And J.B. Rule, whom I quoted earlier, advocated using watersheds as proxy ecosystems for exactly this reason, saying it is imperative that policy decision makers undertake a concerted effort to agree upon a single predominant controlling factor for ecosystem delineation, and of the realistic candidates for that purpose, watersheds stand out as the most suitable and viable planning unit available. Watersheds are thus not merely examples of ecosystems. They are seen by advocates of ecosystem management as near substitutes for ecosystems and as an appropriate physical landscape on which to put ecosystem management concepts into practice. Oliver Brandes and other colleagues put it directly, quote, "A watershed is a complex ecosystem," close quote. Accordingly, the literature on complex adaptive systems may be seen as relating not only to the broad category of ecosystems, but also more particularly to watersheds as ecosystems. Now, in complex adaptive systems, among the most important elements, at least to scholars who have written about complex adaptive systems, are the elements of uncertainty and surprise, which characterize complex adaptive systems, including ecosystems. And this matters to us because the difficulties of predicting ecosystem or watershed behavior are not merely a matter of intellectual curiosity, they are vitally connected to the challenges of management. So I come to a second part of the presentation here on complex adaptive systems and uncertainty, and more particularly something that we call, and we are not alone, scientific uncertainty. Uncertainty, of course, is a term that's used in different contexts. Often, uncertainty is a term we use to signify lack of complete information, insufficient data. There's uncertainty because there's insufficient data. Sometimes it means the presence of noise or risk due to the stochastic or randomly varying nature of some process. But what both of those concepts, or what both of those definitions of uncertainty have in common is that underlying these standard or familiar definitions of uncertainty is an assumption that we know, or believe we know, the basic cause and effect relationships, the system structure that we're studying. We may be short on data, or there may be noise or error elements, but we have the sort of the basic dynamics of the system down. We just lack enough data to be more precise and accurate. We might call these kinds of uncertainty system uncertainty. By contrast, scientific uncertainty involves more than just a lack of reliable data. Scientific uncertainty involves a lack of knowledge or an absence of agreement among scientists about the very nature of the resource system and its dynamic behavior, about what is going on, about what elements of the system are the best indicators of its overall condition, and about what changes in those indicators might mean, or do mean. And by themselves, more or better data would not necessarily diminish or eliminate that kind of uncertainty. It is if we either fundamentally don't know or can't agree upon what it is that we're looking at and how it behaves. Now, the problem of scientific uncertainty has been discussed in the context of complex adaptive systems. And as a result, folks might think that uncertainty is the same as complexity. But the distinction between the two has been, in our view, usefully and clearly articulated by Emery Rowe And let me just quote two sentences here. Rowe wrote, "Issues are uncertain when causal processes are unclear or not easily understood. Issues are complex when causal processes are more numerous, varied, or interrelated than before." Seeing this distinction helps avoid a misconception that underlies much of standard, modern, and one might say engineering-based approaches to environmental management. Namely, that the accumulation and integration of additional data will allow us to understand causal processes better, which will reduce the uncertainty. Rowe continues, and I will quote just briefly again. "It is commonly said that since ecosystems are complex, many of their causal processes are uncertain, which in turn requires learning more about these processes if the ecosystems are to be managed more optimally. Hence, the implicit notion is that complexity leads to uncertainty. And then if you could reduce the uncertainty, it would allow for more complete management of the system." But, Rowe continues, as ecologists remind us, it is also true that a good deal of uncertainty remains even after you've scaled down from the ecosystem level to a specific site, where presumably the components are fewer, and if not less varied or interrelated. Close quote. Now, uncertainty of this type, this scientific uncertainty, is particularly troublesome for understanding or managing complex adaptive systems. Ecologists have struggled for some time with the challenge of being able to describe and predict ecosystem processes. James Wilson, a resource economist, for example, contrasts the Newtonian world, as he calls it, of controllable non-adaptive systems with the ecosystem world of complex adaptive systems. And a problem in the latter, a problem of complex adaptive systems, is the pervasiveness of nonlinear relationships, making it more difficult to trace the particular course of movement of one object in the system and then from that information predict the reactions of other objects. In Richard Carpenter's words, almost all real systems, and certainly all ecosystems, are nonlinear, meaning a small change in one parameter can lead to a sudden large change in behavior. Past approaches to managing ecosystems have typically assumed relatively complete, if stochastic, biological knowledge operating in a Newtonian world. Actual experiences with ecosystem management suggests that the Newtonian view does not apply readily to complex adaptive systems, and perhaps not at all. Why is scientific uncertainty particularly associated with complex adaptive systems? The literature on uncertainty in ecosystem management discusses at least three distinct but interrelated reasons. One is differential rates of change among system components. Another is scale differences, and another is disturbance processes. The factors that make up a complex adaptive system, such as an ecosystem, typically change at different rates. Species populations within the system change at different rates. A host of ambient environmental conditions connected with ecosystem conditions, temperatures, air or water quality, soil composition, etc., change at different rates. Anthropogenic impacts on the system, harvesting behavior, technology, etc., change at different rates as well. In and of themselves, differential rates of change would present a complexity problem rather than an uncertainty problem. The uncertainty problem arises from the fact that in a complex adaptive system, elements respond to changes in other elements. So the differential rates of change yield alterations that are not mere linear extensions of trends. Relationships and effects are contingent state shifts occur among system elements as the configurations of other elements change. So, to use a pretty standard example from ecosystem literature, a 1 degree temperature change in combination with one configuration of ambient conditions produces little effect on a species population, but an additional degree of temperature change occurring in combination with a slightly different configuration of other ambient conditions produces a crash or a surge in that species population, which triggers shifts in other populations and so on. Interactions and effects also occur across space and time scales. In complex adaptive systems, problems are not always fixed to specific areas, nor can a change of condition in one portion of the system be automatically scaled up to predict system-level effects. In part because of heterogeneities in resource systems, the effects of a condition change in one part of a system may be relatively insulated from the rest, while the same change occurring in a different part of the system translates more directly into system-level transformations. Discontinuities in the relationships between system elements and system effects make it very difficult to extrapolate results from one scale, frequently a research plot or site scale, to higher spatial scales. And furthermore, particularly in the ecosystem context, system processes are interrupted by disturbances. In biological systems, these include effects of infestation and disease, natural disaster, shifts in the ambient environment. In the case of natural resources such as water, disturbance processes clearly include droughts and flooding, but also climate change and even landscape transformations caused by anything from earthquakes to surface mining. Disturbance processes introduce an element of uncertainty, not merely complexity, into the challenge of resource management. And combined with the natural variability of the systems themselves, uncertainty allows for unknowable responses, as Richard Carpenter put it, or true surprises. Rapid and adverse changes may occur for reasons that are unforeseen and poorly understood. In complex adaptive systems, there are changes in conditions that are not trends, but there are also changes in conditions that are trends. And among other things, scientific uncertainty with respect to complex adaptive systems means that we lack a good way of knowing which changes are trends and which are not. This does not mean that ecosystems are completely beyond our comprehension or that their behavior is entirely random, but our ability to see and understand the order and predictability of complex adaptive systems is different. We can observe patterns that repeat within systems over time, even though they don't repeat in exactly the same way each time. And sometimes system or subsystem conditions shift in ways that set into motion a different set of patterns. Understanding those patterns is useful science. Still, that science may allow us to make only qualitative and contingent predictions rather than quantitative and precise ones. And that affects our decision making. What does this have to do with the management of watersheds? Well, by whatever means and for whatever reasons, ecosystem considerations have become a more common element of watershed management. The incorporation of ecosystem protection and or ecosystem recovery tasks necessitates at least some replacement of engineering-based hydraulic water management with a broader, less precise, less controlled approach. Borrowing Wilson's language, integrated watershed management, as it's sometimes called, exchanges the Newtonian world, where water was understood as a physical mass to be captured, diverted, stored, and delivered in particular quantities with the required qualities at specific locations and times, for a new and more uncertain world in which water retains all of those physical properties and yet is habitat and other values at the same time. Over the same period that ecosystem elements have been integrated into watershed management, other ideas have emerged and been adopted concerning the physical dimensions of the water resource itself. It's a familiar list to those of you who study water management. It's the emphasis on stream and river channel restoration, ripping out concrete channels, returning streams to meandering courses with soft beds. It's being undertaken in a number of locations, advocated in other locations as a means of rebalancing flood control objectives with other considerations, such as reduced runoff and erosion, enhanced groundwater replenishment, etc. Restoration efforts, I should say, have also been supported by communities rediscovering the economic and aesthetic value of waterfronts and stream courses. Wetlands are being constructed and restored to achieve in-site water quality improvement in preference to standard divert and treat methods. And as sound and, from a 21st century perspective, desirable as all of these ideas for water resource management are, they do reduce the engineering-based control over the physical water resources in a watershed. The presence of human societies in the watershed adds another complex adaptive system component. Karl Walters, the early advocate of adaptive ecosystem management, pointed out that focusing resource management on the physical landscape alone overlooks the socioeconomic dynamics that are never completely controlled by management activities either. The presence of human beings in the watershed creates potentials for unexpected dynamic processes as well. Walters himself analogized the human-environment relationship to a predator-prey relationship and cautioned us not to limit our attention to the prey because, as he wrote, the predators don't sit still either. How do these changes in our understanding of water resources and in our goals for management relate to our decision-making within and about watersheds? What kinds of institutional arrangements might people use when attempting to manage and protect watersheds as complex adaptive systems? Answering these questions turns us to the other main theme of the talk, which is the uses and properties of institutions. The view of watersheds as ecosystems, and both watersheds and ecosystems as types of complex adaptive systems, has substantial and far-reaching implications for decision-making. And those implications have ramifications of their own for the kinds of organizational and governance structures that human beings devise and employ. Devising and employing, creating and adapting decision-making arrangements bring political considerations into the heart of the watershed. As already noted, scientific uncertainty implies a lack of consensus over what elements of a system are the best indicators of its overall condition, and a lack of agreement about what a change in one or more of those indicators at any particular time signifies. Under those circumstances, the selection of policy targets becomes especially unclear. And so does our understanding of how policy actions relate to those targets. Furthermore, if resource managers focus their attention on a few selected policy targets, undesired and undesirable results may occur as other elements of the system shift in unanticipated ways. So in addition to challenging our ability to pursue comprehensive decision-making generally, scientific uncertainty poses problems for the role of science itself in policy making. In the protection and management of complex adaptive systems, where our uncertainty concerns the underlying system processes themselves, and we do not entirely understand relationships comprising the system or driving its transformations over time, both the scientific problem and the policy problem are not just harder, they're different. Wilson, for example, points out that much of environmental policymaking and management, at least in the United States, is performed through the delegation of authority to regulatory agencies. And this is done with the underlying presumption that science will be employed in regulatory decision-making and will also be available to check and correct regulatory errors. In light of uncertainty about system processes and cause and effect relationships, science loses some ability through its usual methods of professional criticism and consensus development to provide policymakers with specific predictions or to check the mistaken exercise of policymaking authority. And this change in the relationship of science to decision-making poses two significant problems. One is that science's eroded role in guiding decision-making opens the field for regulatory instruments to serve other political and economic purposes, including something that is familiar probably to many of you, the ability of some interests to use scientific uncertainty as an excuse to delay action. Another problem is error proneness. Scientific uncertainty expands the prospects for regulatory decision-making to produce wrong decisions, to produce misguided or maladaptive policies. Failure to recognize and acknowledge uncertainty can magnify the error proneness of management efforts. Bobby Lowe and colleagues whom I quoted earlier have observed that decision makers tend to underestimate the uncertainty and overestimate their understanding of problems. This makes error correction even more important. Error correction depends on error detection, and as Keith Caldwell, one of the fathers of environmental policy studies, points out, uncertainty unacknowledged is a factor that handicaps efforts to discover whether error has occurred. Failure to acknowledge uncertainty or pretending it doesn't exist lessens our ability to develop and implement management practices that have learning elements designed deliberately into them, and exposes us to more catastrophic errors that can result from an incomplete understanding of the resource systems. Now, a caveat, just as uncertainty doesn't mean that natural systems behave randomly or are incomprehensible, uncertainty additionally does not mean that scientific research on natural systems is of no use to policymakers. Science concerning complex adaptive systems such as ecosystems has great value, because even the limited vision that we have is far more valuable than a sense that the future is totally unpredictable and not subject to our influence. The limited vision that is possible with respect to complex adaptive systems is the basis for adaptive management, a term that I would imagine is probably familiar to most of you. In light of the contemporary tasks of managing watersheds, which include integrating species and habitat protection, restoring streams, constructing wetlands, taking more seriously the dynamic and adaptive human communities within watersheds, and so on. Adaptive management warrants consideration in the watershed context. This is a point that was argued effectively a decade and a half ago by Kai Lee and has been reiterated more recently by Brent Swallow and colleagues. But adaptive management has high information requirements too. Its information requirements are of a different sort than those that would be required by a comprehensive decision-making model, however. In the management of complex adaptive systems, the general predictions underlying policy actions have to be closely and continually compared with observations of the resource system. And furthermore, this close monitoring and comparison will need to be done at multiple scales and with respect to multiple indicators. Arrangements are therefore needed that will enhance information collection, enhance error detection, and enhance opportunities for adaptation. And further advances are difficult if scientists and policymakers do not engage questions of organization. What kinds of institutions might be able to counteract unacknowledged uncertainty, might be able to closely check general predictions against actual physical conditions, and might be able to substitute for the hoped-for role of science as a check on decision-making. Questions like this are of substantial interest to political scientists. What kinds of institutional arrangements serve which kinds of purposes? This brings me to the next section. If we have viewed the uncertainty problem as if it were a typical engineering problem, more data, calculate error margins, and if we have constructed on the basis of that institutions such as integrated regulatory agencies that are supposed to sort of comprehensively monitor everything, we may have created institutions and administrative procedures that are poorly adapted to a solution of the problem of managing complex adaptive systems. And one of those ill-adapted institutions includes efforts at comprehensive regulation through integrated agencies. The desire for comprehensive decision-making still holds a lot of attraction in the literatures on watershed management in particular and ecosystem management more generally. And it's implicitly associated with the notion of some integrated decision-making apparatus, some agency. Advocacy of integrated decision-making organizations such as unified river basin agencies or watershed authorities is often justified in terms of the need for comprehensive decision-making that encompasses all affected interests and addresses all interrelated resources within a watershed or within an ecosystem. Other authors, including my colleague Adela Schlager and myself, are skeptical of using an integrated decision-making organization for the management of complex adaptive systems. What reasons could be advanced for an alternative to the ideal of the integrated comprehensive resource management agency? The rationale appears to be composed of three common themes: recognition of scale diversity, reducing error proneness and promoting learning, and overcoming limitations on human capabilities, particularly human capabilities with respect to information processing. In complex adaptive natural resource systems, organizations at multiple scales may be useful to gather and exchange information about resource conditions. Lance Gunderson and colleagues observed that, and I quote, resource systems that have been sustained over long time periods increase resilience by managing processes at multiple scales. Close quote. Such arrangements are likely to include relatively small local organizations that can focus on particular locations or subsystems, approaching the complex adaptive system by being modular and decomposable, made up of smaller, albeit interrelated elements, borrowing, in other words, an organizational design concept from Herbert Simon. Now, the argument for smaller local organizations attending to particular subsystems does not presume that uncertainty disappears at small scales. In other words, this is not a complexity argument in disguise. Rather, the argument for smaller local organizations attending to particular subsystems acknowledges that complex systems are usually composed of subsystems, and subsystem levels are more nearly amenable to close monitoring and to the development of improved understanding of those patterns of activity that complex adaptive systems display. Especially for large, geographically extensive systems that have multiple and heterogeneous local subsystems, smaller organizations could be better suited to monitoring and managing those local conditions, noticing changes more rapidly and notifying others of them. Of course, small local organizations won't be all that's needed by any means. Overlapping organizations at larger scales can serve as forums for communication across local subsystems and also a check on local structures that behave in ways that are detrimental to other subsystems. A second theme is the importance of reducing error proneness and promoting learning, an effort that may actually be aided by some degree of duplication and redundancy of organizational structure, that is, of having more than one organization looking at the same system. In the kind of adaptive management that has been advocated for complex adaptive systems such as ecosystems, the real key to progress is learning. And learning could be accelerated in a diversified institutional setting where multiple interventions are being undertaken and compared within the same system simultaneously with opportunities to exchange results, observe each other's experiences, and compare. By contrast, limited attention to just a few selected indicators of system conditions is dangerous. And yet this is exactly what a comprehensive organization trying to monitor and manage a complete, complex system is likely to try to do. So it may be that polycentric structures of overlapping organizations, networks, federal systems, other kinds of multi-organizational arrangements are an organizational option that can increase the likelihood of checks upon the continued maintenance of poorly adapted or poorly performing policies and practices. Safeguards like that could exist within a comprehensive integrated agency as well, but a century of organizational behavior research suggests that more nearly centralized organizations are susceptible internally to big distortions of information and communication that can allow poor policies and practices to persist for undesirably long periods. In fact, it may be especially important to avoid organizational integration where information distortions or information losses can cascade into dramatically erroneous decisions and actions. Consider, for example, Landau's critique of integrated hierarchical structures. Quote, organizational systems of this type are a form of administrative brinksmanship. They are extraordinary gambles. When one bulb goes, everything goes. Close quote. More directly in relation to the ecosystem management challenge, Wilson adds, perhaps the only reasonable institutional response to this problem is to maintain nearly independent, nearly decomposable local governing units. Their ability to probe different policies and to remain skeptical without great cost is one of the few ways there may be to constrain persistent, poorly performing policies and assure the continuing evolution of the institution. Ludwig Walker and Holling employ the metaphor of a raft representing institutions for managing ecological systems, thinking of institutions trying to manage ecological systems as a raft floating upon a shifting and sometimes turbulent surface. And that raft has to withstand unexpected or unpredictable waves or unexpected or unpredictable shifts of weight. And they write in that raft metaphor the following. They say, another possible response to disturbance would be to restructure the raft. If it were constructed of several loosely coupled subunits, then excessive weighting or a strong disturbance might flip one part of the system, but leave the rest intact. Such a structure might not require as much vigilance as the single raft, and it might be able to withstand a greater variety of external disturbances. On the other hand, if the bindings that link the subunits become stiff, then the structure may become brittle and hence more prone to failure. The concept of decomposability and the metaphor of the single raft bring us to a third theme, which is the limited information processing and decision-making capabilities of single systems, which is a theme that really applies the concept of bounded rationality, which is a characteristic of individuals, to organizations. The problems of limits to understanding and limits to cognition may not be solved merely by the often prescribed organizational fix of scale matching. Get the right organization at the right scale, match the scale of the resource system to the scale of the organization, creating organizations to correspond with the boundaries of a complex resource system. Simon, as I mentioned earlier, advocated what he called nearly decomposable rather than centralized organizational structures to deal with complex systems, balancing, on the one hand, the need for close interaction and specialized expertise against, on the other hand, the need for communication and integration. Because of the complexity of systems and the uncertainty associated with large numbers of adaptive components in multiple relationships that vary continuously and discontinuously over space and time, no one individual, no one group can hope to adequately address the learning problem. One of the great scholars of water resource management, Gilbert White, put it this way with particular reference to managing water resources. He says, truly comprehensive analysis is challenging to say the least. And White maintained that for any of us, his words here, the constraints of professional training and competence, the limits of organizational authority, and the ignorance of the outcomes of many actions, past and future, impede the balanced formulation of potential solutions and options in dealing with such aims as efficient use of water for food, or for transportation, or for ecosystem health. We may, in other words, he suggested, by ourselves or individually, just not be up to the task. Intriguingly, in a recent comparison of two cases, an article published this year in Journal of American Water Resources Association by Slaughter and Liner compared two watersheds and found that the one with the single agency operated less effectively at detecting and solving complex problems within the watershed than the watershed that had polycentric arrangements. Now, of course, managing and protecting complex adaptive systems would be complicated enough even if human uses and interests and values were not at stake. The addition of human beings brings an additional set of multiple scales. Just as the physical dimension of a watershed appear at different scales, so too the multiple human uses and behaviors that occur in a watershed, complicating further the tasks of decision-making, as well as the tasks of monitoring and enforcement. Once we contemplate individuals and communities interacting with the natural resources within a watershed, the how questions about decision-making arrangements are compounded by for whom questions. When we think about how to make decisions and for whom, boundary issues, who belongs in and who doesn't, are not only complicated, but they take on an added intensity. As countless authors have observed, human communities have rarely been organized to coincide with ecosystem boundaries, even the more visible boundaries of watersheds. The communities that matter most to people, and where established decision-making structures already exist, typically are either smaller than the watershed or straddle watershed boundaries. Neither form of organization is likely to displace the other, and reconciling them adds further complexity to the task of institutional design. Neither a single decision-making principle nor a single organization at a single scale is therefore likely to suffice. Instead, institutional arrangements suited to decision-making about complex adaptive systems may themselves need to exhibit some features of complexity and adaptability. In the uncertain world of complex social and ecological systems, institutional richness may be preferable to institutional neatness. Multi-scale institutional arrangements, including small and local organizations linked horizontally with each other and vertically with larger scale organizations, may be able to achieve close monitoring of local subsystem conditions, representation of diverse interests associated with different physical components of the system as a whole, error correction when management practices that were undertaken with respect to one element of the system create unanticipated negative effects elsewhere in the system, and opportunities to communicate and exchange information across subsystem elements and to discuss subsystem interactions and system-wide conditions without necessarily trying to manage all parts of the system within a comprehensive organization. Multi-level governance is a topic of intense study within my discipline of political science these days. And in a very useful article distilling decades of theoretical development, Lisbeth Hoog and Gary Marks have distinguished between type 1 and type 2 governance structures. Type 1 structures in the Hug and Marx typology are defined by constituency, and they're typically multifunctional organizations. So in the United States, for example, a municipality, a city or a town, is a type 1 governance structure. It's defined by a constituency. The limits encompass some population, and within those limits, the governance structure performs multiple functions. It clears your streets, patrols your homes, puts out fires, etc. In the United States, type 1 governance structures exist at different scales, from cities and towns, counties, local level, states, national government. They are familiar to us. They typically exhibit the familiar branches of government, a legislative body, a judicial forum, executive capability, and they're nested. Cities encompassed by states, states encompassed by the nation, and as I mentioned, with respect to places like Europe, even the possibility of supra-levels, international organizations. But type 1 governance structures don't overlap horizontally. That is, one city doesn't spill over into the boundaries of another city. And each type 1 jurisdiction is therefore a sort of a multi-function mechanism for governance within its own domain. And these do some very useful things for us. They help us bargain and trade off in decision making, whether to spend more this year on policing or street maintenance. Those kinds of trade-offs are served well by having multifunctional organizations serving the same territory and population. Type 2 governmental structures are not defined by a constituency, but by a function. And they're typically single function or limited function governments, and their boundaries will vary from one service or function to another. Type 2 structures are established at whatever geographical scale may be suited to funding and delivering a particular service. So, what we have tens of thousands of in the United States, special districts. A library district, an airport authority, a water district, a sewer district, etc. Single function or maybe limited function, maybe one or two things that the jurisdiction does. The jurisdiction is scaled geographically, small or large, has whatever boundaries it is created with in order to capture what somebody thought would be, sort of economies of scale or the proper domain for that function to be performed in. Type 2 structures typically don't feature executive, legislative, and judicial branches. They're usually not set up like that. Rarely in the United States, for example, would a Type 2 jurisdiction like a special district have a judicial forum of any kind. And Type 2 governments can and often do overlap horizontally, so that you as a citizen wouldn't live in two different cities, but you might live in a sewer district and an airport authority and a library district, and these things can sort of go all over the place, and the boundaries of the library district don't have to correspond to the libraries of the sewer district and so forth. They have, therefore, some advantages of flexibility in jurisdictional size and specialization of function. Type 1 jurisdictions have some advantages for us in terms of being able to make trade-offs and bargains between functions and services. Type 2 organizations have some advantages in terms of flexibility of size and specialization of function. On the other hand, precisely because of that specialization, they're usually not engaged in trade-offs or bargaining among service priorities. They're focused on what they do. And if there are conflicts involving the performance or priorities of Type 2 structures, those conflicts often have to be resolved in the judicial forums over in some Type 1 structure somewhere. Now, what was all that about? Well, although these governance forms are different, what Hoag and Marx point out is that they are compatible and complementary. That in any community of any size and complexity, you're going to need some of both. Because your type 1 jurisdictions are going to create spillover effects for one another, externalities that you're then going to need type 2 jurisdictions to capture or to fill in those gaps. But type 2 jurisdictions, as we've already said, can't do everything in the way of representation, trade-offs, and they're not always communities that people relate to organically like they do with their city or their state or something like that. What we find in looking across the United States and probably the rest of the globe, although my colleague and I haven't looked that far yet, is that in most, and maybe in all, watersheds and ecosystems, combinations of type 1 and type 2 governance structures will exist. Additional ones may be created, existing ones may be modified, and the relationships between them adjusted from time to time. Overall, then, the institutional arrangements in a watershed may themselves be thought of as a kind of complex adaptive system, or maybe at least a complex adaptable system, composed of multiple elements at different scales and operating both independently and interdependently. And for reasons already noted, scale differences, disturbance processes, the importance of reducing error proneness while increasing error detection and learning, complex adaptable systems of institutions may be well suited to the management and protection of complex adaptive natural resource systems. Brent Swallow and his colleagues have reached such a conclusion with particular reference to the management of watersheds. They wrote, and I'm going to quote again briefly here, the scale at which the physical environment is optimally managed may not correspond to any one decision-making body in a community. In that case, collective action within existing institutions or through the creation of new institutions becomes critical for managing watershed resources. Decision-making does not have to be embedded in only one body at one level, but different management responsibilities can be devolved to different bodies. This is the concluding section of the talk. Institutional arrangements are human creations. They're matters of choice. And there have been recommendations to try to match organizational boundaries to watershed boundaries and to create comprehensive jurisdictions since the time of John Wesley Powell. And yet, despite a century and more of such recommendations, there are very few examples of comprehensive watershed or river basin agencies to be found. Not just in the United States, but pretty much around the globe. And even where watershed scale entities have been created, they are often internally complex, intricately interconnected with smaller and larger jurisdictions of both type 1 and type 2 characteristics. Very impressive empirical analysis reported by Mark Lubell and colleagues in 2002 found that collective action in America's watersheds, for example, is being attempted and accomplished instead of through integrated agencies, instead through literally thousands of watershed partnerships and network-style structures involving numerous public and private organizations of varied sizes and functions. Why is this so? Why have we so rarely chosen to create comprehensive organizations based on hydrological boundaries? Is the partnership approach merely the path of least resistance? Are watershed stakeholders relying on partnerships and networks because it's just too hard to create comprehensive watershed agencies that deep down they really would prefer to have, but they just don't want to go through the political hassle of trying to create them? The final report of the National Watershed Forum, held in 2001, was particularly interesting to us in this regard. After 3 days of meetings, the hundreds of participants, some of the Americans most intensively involved in watershed management from one end of the country to the other, produced a report including several pages of key recommendations and findings. Right? These are people who are doing watershed management, making recommendations and findings. There were 5 pages of recommendations and findings alone concerning watershed organization, governance, and participation. This is not an inconsequential list. Right? This is a list of findings and recommendations that goes on for 5 pages concerning watershed organization, governance, and participation. And not one of those findings or recommendations called for the establishment of more centralized and comprehensive watershed scale agencies. People engaged in watershed management produced 5 pages of findings and recommendations about watershed governance, decision-making, participation, and organization, and not one of the recommendations is for centralized, comprehensive watershed agencies to be created. Rather, most of the recommendations emphasized maintaining a variety of organizations at a variety of scales while enhancing their exchange of information and coordination between them. Participants even suggested, one of the recommendations even suggested, replacing watershed coordination teams organized at the federal and regional scale. These were things that the federal government had started to create, watershed scale coordination teams. Participants suggested replacing watershed coordination teams with ones organized around state boundaries. Now, since almost no state boundaries in the United States match watershed boundaries, this recommendation is a notable departure from the watershed management literature's emphasis on superseding traditional political boundaries like states in favor of regional scale, preferably hydrologically defined, entities. At last, the participants recommended the establishment of more small sub-watershed, what they called stream teams, to monitor local conditions more closely. Altogether, the forum's findings and recommendations displayed an intriguing divergence from years of literature recommending integrated watershed agencies, but an intriguing congruence with the analysis in this presentation about the relationship between nature's complex adaptive systems and humans' complex adaptable systems. Even individuals closely involved in and committed to watershed management did not recommend the creation of integrated watershed agencies. They were inclined towards greater organizational complexity rather than less. Nature has a lot of complex adaptive systems: watersheds, continents, lakes and seas, prairies, tropics, wildlife habitats, etc., from the micro scale to the intercontinental scale. Human beings still have to choose how and around what to organize their activities. We do not get to just let nature do the choosing for us, pointing to topographical boundaries or other physical features as a way of defining communities of interest and crafting decision-making processes. Despite their importance and visibility, why watersheds or river basins should have primacy in the shaping of human decisions remains open to question. Furthermore, even if people chose to organize decision-making arrangements around watersheds, it would hardly be the end of the choices to be made. Which watershed? Which boundaries? For good or ill, for example, nature's watershed boundaries have been altered by human actions in many cases all over the planet. So even if we zero in on watersheds or basins as our organizational ideal, we still have to choose how to bound the decision-making arrangements. I apologize for bringing you a bunch of Western examples that I'm about to mention, but they're the ones I know best, as Professor Van Gosh indicated. Is Los Angeles in the Owens River Valley, or isn't it? Not should it be. Is it? Is Denver on the eastern side of the divide? Is Denver in the Colorado River Basin or not? They've run tunnels through the mountains to bring water from the Colorado River Basin to Denver. They're not naturally or hydrologically in the Colorado River Basin, but they kind of stuck a straw in there and put themselves in the Colorado River Basin. Going to organize decision-making arrangements around the Colorado River Basin? Is the Front Range in or is the Front Range out? Still got choices to make, right? Are San Diegans, who receive a good portion of their fresh water supply from Northern California, are San Diegans in the Sacramento River watershed? One could pose an almost endless list of questions like this. And they're not idle questions. They have to be addressed in order for watershed management to proceed. You can't not answer these questions. Communities of interest already exist in and for many watersheds. And topographical features do not always go very far in telling us who those communities of interest are or how they should be involved. Who is in? Who is out? Who gets to decide what we're going to do? How do we decide? These are political questions, and they are inescapably political questions no matter what natural boundaries we try to employ and no matter what organizational structures we try to construct. Complex systems of institutional arrangements can appear chaotic to observers, understandably so. The institutional landscape of a watershed, like its physical and ecological landscape, can be and often is complicated. Although there are ways to make sense of that landscape, distinction between type 1 and type 2 structures is a simple but useful one. The institutional arrangements in a watershed are likely to be complicated and on initial view even confusing. Institutional complexity in a watershed can be viewed as an intrinsically undesirable trait to be minimized, an intrinsically desirable trait to be maximized, or as a phenomenon that is intrinsically neither good nor bad, but a fact of life, and where the extent and kinds of complexity will vary from one watershed to another. And the questions of what institutional forms that complexity takes and how institutional arrangements operate are empirical ones. They are also political questions. It isn't only a physical watershed, it's a political one too. And questions about the governance of water resources are questions about the social and political tools people use to govern and manage themselves and their relationships to each other and their relationships to nature. And that was all I came to tell you, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.